Hey, this is Bryce Johnson from Expedition Bigfoot. You're listening to the Paranomaly Zone.
Look, I know the supernatural is something that isn't supposed to happen, but it does happen.
A ghostly apparition in the dark of night.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Hey there, ponderers of the paranormal. It is interview time in the Paranomaly Zone. Mike and I just had the absolute pleasure and privilege of talking with Professor of Anatomy and Anthropology and world-renowned Sasquatch researcher Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Dr. Meldrum's study of primates has led him from international museums to the remote badlands of South America. He also researches the fossil footprints and skeletons of early humans. His book, From Biped to Strider, examines the evolutionary timing and pattern of modern human gaits. Dr. Meldrum's tracking of Sasquatch began in 1996 when he crossed paths with an enigmatic set of 15-inch footprints in southeastern Washington. Dr. Meldrum continues to conduct collaborative laboratory and field research throughout North America as well as China and Russia, and has spoken about his findings in numerous interviews, television appearances, and public and professional presentations. His book, Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, was described by Dr. Jane Goodall as bringing, quote, a much-needed level of scientific analysis to the Sasquatch Bigfoot debates. But you're not here to listen to this intro. You want to listen to the man himself. We hope you enjoy our chat with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
Very nice to meet you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, this is pretty exciting for us. You've been on our list of dream guests for several years, so this is pretty cool.
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Hope I live up to the anticipation.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no doubt about that. No doubt about that. As you can see, my co-host has joined the chat.
It's great to meet you. Great to see you. You have, I don't know if Patrick had mentioned this to you before I got on, but you are definitely our dream guest.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was telling him I hope that I can live up to the anticipation and expectations, but it should be fun. It should be fun.
For formalities, my name is Patrick, and obviously that is my co-host Michael. We are honored to speak with you, Dr. Meldrum. This is going to be a blast, and we're looking forward to being educated. So, one thing, when we do these guest interviews, by the way, do you prefer to be called Doctor or Jeff?
Well, once you get past the introductions and that business, then Jeff is just fine.
Jeff is just fine. Excellent.
Yeah,
excellent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes I call Mike Doctor every now and then, but he doesn't deserve it.
Yeah,
so.
and I have no idea why, but I just let him go.
Yeah.
So when we start our guest interviews, I usually throw out, a kind of a casual, maybe not necessarily off the wall type question. I'll just go for broke here. As a professor of anatomy and anthropology, very esteemed career, do any of your fellow professional colleagues and stuff, do they kind of think of you as like, well, he's the rogue doctor. He's out there looking at some of the crazy Sasquatch stuff every now and then, or do they absolutely accept what you are doing as needed, as required research?
Well, first off, I'm not held in such high esteem by my colleagues. I mean, I've done solid work and I've made, I think, important contributions. I think I have championed some novel ideas that took, in some cases, a decade or more to finally gain traction, but then eventually be accepted, be recognized. I mean, something as straightforward, which had a direct spin-off from my preoccupation with the Sasquatch, the model of the Sasquatch foot. That is that these early hominins were walking on flat, flexible feet with a very mobile mid-tarsal region. For the longest time, the principles involved in the discovery and early analysis of the Laetoli hominin footprints, the famous tracks in East Africa, described them as being basically walking like little people, with feet that were indistinguishable and footprints that were indistinguishable from our own. And quite frankly, that was the result of an ideological bias. I mean, there was a push that the human species could trace its origins way back, and that we were essentially, I mean, once we were upright, we were essentially people. And our ancestors were essentially people, not much different than us. And anyway, now it's very much appreciated that the adaptation of early bipeds was bipedalism on flat, flexible feet, with a non-divergent toe, but with the absence of an arch. I mean, the paradigm was that you didn't have to, that the reason for losing the abduction of the big toe, losing that divergence of that thumb-like big toe, was to incorporate it into a longitudinal arch. And I argued, no, it's the other way around. The reason to have a divergent big toe is to climb trees. If you're not climbing trees, there's no selection pressure to maintain that late appearing development in the growth and development of the fetus and so on. And there are many advantages to not having that toe sticking out to the side like that when walking on the ground. And it's so funny. Just recently, there was a paper that came out where renewed attention was directed to an additional set of footprints at the Laetoli site, and that has a more distinctive appearance. They're much broader feet, different proportions. Although I have to say that, I mean, it just shows you how it's everywhere. You think politics is the only place where you can't trust anybody to not spin their message, but in anthropology, they're spinning all the time, and everyone has their narrative that they're pushing. So when they show these, in order to emphasize the distinction of these rather neglected footprints, they juxtapose them with a photo that is often used, but rarely is it identified as a double step. It's where two footprints of two individuals have been partially superimposed, and it gives the foot this much more elongated, more human-looking appearance, which promotes that narrative. Oh, they're just little feet, like little people walking around with feet like ours. So the comparison's completely misleading to begin with. But the point I wanted to make was they drew attention to some of the distinguishing characteristics of this other additional line of tracks, and they drew attention to a feature in the midfoot, which they identified as a mid-tarsal pressure ridge. Now, the only place you'll find, if you were to Google that term, the only place you'll find reference to it anywhere in the past two decades is my work on the Sasquatch footprints. And then my references, my comparisons of those features as evident in the other Laetoli, the original Laetoli footprints. And then you'll see all sorts of other explanations for that artifact, that feature. So I found that bemusing, because finally there's that acknowledgement, but there's no citation of my references where it's published. No credit to my having drawn attention. I mean, it's not that I'm after credit, but this just illustrates a point. Back to your original question about esteem and the perception of my colleagues. The common attitude or stance, the treatment is now not to criticize me, not to verbally, castigate me, but rather just ignore it. Ignore it, not even draw attention. I mean, this was one of the problems I had in my bids, multiple bids for full professorship, was against the prejudice in my own department in college. One of the reviews, it was so blatant, and at that point, it was the deans finally just stepped in. But when the college committee evaluated my record, they quite intentionally, the chair of the committee in particular, who was a member of my department and very critical, just ignored anything that had to do with Sasquatch, and then also pointed out the glaring gaps in my publication record. And so, even though in the department report, one of my more sympathetic and supportive colleagues had gone to the trouble of, some people place undue credence on these ridiculous indices that really aren't very helpful or useful in questions of evaluation and promotion and so forth, and merit evaluation. But he went through and calculated one of those popular statistics on my publication record, as she did, eliminating all such references. And still, my index was above the average for the last 5 promotions to full professor in our department. Even without all those other publications, many of which were in peer-reviewed journals, were absolutely worthwhile and noteworthy works of scholarship. So it's been an interesting and eye-opening experience. I hate to dwell on the negative. I mean, for all those very negative experiences, and there's been a lot of them, and it's been an unfortunate, there have been a lot of very positive experiences. I mean, up above my desk here, I've got this picture of where I had the opportunity to attend one of Jane Goodall's presentations, and she was very magnanimous in providing a blurb, a little review or commentary, endorsement of my book when it came out after reading it. And so the cover boasts that quotation from her, not endorsing the existence of Sasquatch, but endorsing the scientific legitimacy of asking the question and pursuing the question of whether such a creature exists. And so I've got a picture of me standing next to her in front of her, her banner with my book and her signature next to her commentary, and that's a treasure.
Yeah.
I tell you. And, when George Schaller wrote the foreword to my book, George doesn't necessarily have the name recognition that Jane, the popular name recognition amongst my colleagues. I mean, his stature, he's the naturalist's naturalist. I mean, probably the most renowned and acclaimed naturalist of the past century. And he has always had sort of, I don't want to say a closet, but an interest, a side interest in this question of relic hominoids, whether it's the Yeti in the Himalayas or whether it's Sasquatch in North America. And so he appeared on Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, the documentary. And so, kind of as a shot in the dark, I thought, well, hey, what have I got to lose? I sent a copy of the manuscript to him and asked him, would you consider, this is in part a companion volume to that documentary in which you appeared, but it's much more. I mean, it's far expanded far beyond the confines of that 50-minute documentary. And to my delight, he read it and he wrote back and he said, I'm packing to leave the country. He said, I've read it. It's fantastic. He said, will just, 2 or 3 pages do? And I said, oh, absolutely.
2 or 3. Nice.
So again, he wrote, and so you turn the soft cover over and the quotation emblazoned on the back cover is one from that foreword. And again, he didn't endorse the existence, but he pointed out that this was a very fascinating, intriguing question of zoology and anthropology, and said very kind things about my efforts to bring scientific inquiry to bear objectively on this question without prejudice or preconception. And and so those are real visible examples, but I have so many conversations behind the scenes with so many different scholars, and for obvious reasons. I mean, I'm out there as the poster child of why not to come out of the closet. If you're I've got a thick skin, and I've managed to soldier through the slings and arrows of of indignation, or however you want to describe it. But especially for a young, I was idealistic enough, perhaps a little naive, to jump into the deep end of the pool even before I had tenure. And that, you don't want to, I don't like to characterize tenure as this bunker where you can, once you're inside, you can do whatever the heck you want.
Sure.
But it produces, or lends some job security so that the idealistic principles of academic freedom are realized, are not just words alone, but they're acted upon, and they provide real academic job security, scholarly job security. And so it was a bumpy ride. It was a bumpy ride, and I certainly would not recommend that to new graduate students or recommend that to new junior faculty who don't have that job security. I encourage students, and go ahead. I'm rambling.
No, gosh, no, that's
not at all.
Not at all. We're enraptured here.
Definitely mesmerized.
Do you feel like, even if it's in the slightest percentage, do you feel that more and more of your colleagues may be coming around to the possibility?
Oh yes, because things have changed. See, I always ask myself, why is there this visceral rejection? Why is this so stigmatized as a thing of the tabloid instead of a possible scientific question? And then, as I've learned with age and with hindsight, to understand questions like that so often, so frequently, you have to juxtapose it against the backdrop of the times, of the history, of culture and society. And in the history of anthropology, see, I started, I started my doctoral in 84. So it was kind of just on the tail end of a concept which during the 60s and 70s was in its heyday, and that was what was called the single species hypothesis. So you've got this this kind of new discipline of anthropology, especially physical and paleoanthropology, as the hominin fossil record is beginning to burgeon. And these anthropologists, which anthropology was always considered a soft science compared to math or physics and so forth, chemistry. And so to lend or to incorporate more interdisciplinary approaches and concepts, anthropologists looked around, and here was something that was kind of interesting. It was the niche hypothesis, which was one of the central tenets of ecology, who had in turn borrowed it from microbiology, where it emerged in the 30s, from a notion called the competitive exclusion principle. Fancy name, but what it simply means, everyone kind of knows this adage: one niche, one species. You can only have one species at any address out there in ecology. And this, the microbiologists discovered that if they say, grew paramecium, this was the classic textbook example that you often see in biology texts. You grow one species of paramecium in a petri dish and it grows happy, and it's, in a particular medium. Repeat that medium over in this petri dish with another species and it's a happy camper. But then if you combine the two, what they found repeatedly is that one species would outcompete the other and drive it to extinction. So evolution and ecology glommed onto that, and it became the niche hypothesis, the niche concept that one species could occupy a niche. If there were two, or they were brought into sympatry, living in a common area that had similar needs, one either became extinct or there would be partitioning. There would be specialization to a particular subset of resources. Well, anthropologists took this and they said, well, hominins, we're interested in hominins. They're defined by walking on two legs, bipedalism, increased brain size, and above all, culture, making tools, making material artifacts, and so on. That's a pretty narrow, exclusive club. So there can be only one species. And so human evolution was perceived as this unilinear single file march, one species giving rise to another. And like I said, it was reaching kind of its heyday during, and it also fed into this idea, and from this grew out this notion that we're all just one big happy family. We're all, because really, where do you draw the boundary between species? It's kind of arbitrary. So we're really humans, all the way back to our divergence from that last common ancestor shared with the great apes, chimpanzees, most likely. So in the 60s, see, when Ivan Sanderson, you may know of Ivan T. Sanderson, who wrote this encyclopedic book, Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life, and the subtitle, Subhuman Species on 5 Continents. Well, when he published that in 1962, it was in the heyday of the single species hypothesis. So how did anthropologists react? There was no place, for these other 5 proposed subspecies that had persisted alongside us to exist. They couldn't exist, therefore they didn't exist. And so his book was seen as just a flight of fancy. And even in 1967, see, when the Roger Patterson film was shot, when that was shown to the scientists in British Columbia and then subsequently at the Smithsonian, I mean, what could they say? No, I mean, something like that just can't exist. So instead, they came up with all these ridiculous objections why it must be a hoax. I mean, and they were really ridiculous. We won't go into all those, but really ridiculous. But then, see, there was a shift that started to take place. First, there were these alternate forms of Australopithecines, the early human ancestors from South Africa. And initially, some tried, especially the ardent supporters of the single species hypothesis, said, well, these alternate forms must be males and females. And they would try to show how, if you look at a male gorilla and a female gorilla, the male gorilla has this really high crest and ridging and massive canines and so forth. And the female's more gracile. So these differences were gender differences. Well, eventually the sample grew to the point where that could no longer be sustained. They clearly were the same species. And they clearly were distinct species, not the same species. And then they thought, well, those initial Australopithecines, they're really little more than bipedal apes. So we haven't really reached the hominin adaptation yet, the hominin niche. So they kicked the can down the road, and to the appearance of the genus Homo. And you had, and that has a whole history in and of itself. But nevertheless, whether you recognize early Homo like Homo habilis and Rudolfensis, or the emergence of with a very distinctive discontinuity with Homo ergaster or Homo erectus, the African form often referred to as Homo ergaster. The problem with that was no sooner was the ink dry on those proclamations than Richard Leakey describes Homo ergaster, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Paranthropus boisei, all living at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
How can this be? Well, and then they just kick the can further down. Well, once Homo sapiens emerged, now, we are the last hominin standing. But in the face of continuing discovery of new species, so that instead of this single file lineage, now the tree starts to show branches and contemporaneous species coexisting at any slice of time. And so instead of a single, lodgepole pine, we've got this bushy tree with multiple species coexisting. And it was recognized that some of these branches persisted until dates that were much more recent than would have been acknowledged, 20, 30, 40 years ago as a possibility. And so, you've got Neanderthals coexisting with Homo sapiens. You've got Homo heidelbergensis. There are some specimens as potentially as young as 20,000 years in East Asia. You had the discovery of the hobbit, Homo floresiensis, which initially was somewhere between 14 and 18,000 years. Now it's gotten pushed back as they refine some of the stratigraphy, the dating, and the cave deposits. But even at 50,000 years, I mean, one thing that you have to learn from the study of the fossil record, as capricious and as meager as it is, that the last appearance doesn't mean that's when they went extinct. That just happens to be when the last fossil was discovered.
Right.
And so, 50,000 years is just a snap of the fingers. So, if you got in a time machine, went back in East Asia 20, 30,000 years ago, you might bump into any one of 6 different species that we know of at this point. And that's the problem. There's no abatement to the pace of discovery of new species constantly being added. So it's a much more complex story. And so now, all of a sudden, instead of, flailing around, what do we do with this? What if this thing on the Patterson-Gimlin film were real? Where could we accommodate it? Well, now there's all sorts of places. It could be a Gigantopithecus extant. It could be a Paranthropus extant. There are a number of possibilities. So, again, going back to your question, with that backdrop, the new generation, just as I kind of came up right on the tail end of the single species hypothesis, I mean, at a point when we still learned about it, but we fully recognized that there were gracile, and I mean, there still were textbooks that had this comparison between gracile and robust Australopithecines and trying to explain it away as male and female of a single species. Now you have students who are not indoctrinated by that dogma and recognize the fluidity and complexity of the hominin fossil record. And it wasn't too long ago. Time slips by so fast; it's amazing. But New Scientist magazine, which is Britain's equivalent, say, of our Scientific American or Discover magazine, sort of a semi-technical, popular science magazine. But they had a special issue, and the entire issue was devoted to what the editorial board considered the top 10 questions facing human evolution, the study of human evolution today. And number 9 was, are other hominins alive today? And I mean, I saw that, and I was, unfortunately, the associate editor who was in charge of writing that article did an unfortunately poor job, but I was interviewed for it, but I was just so excited because 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that never would have been. Well, now it'd be 20 years. It's been almost 10 years since that issue came out, but and still, it doesn't have an overt impact, so that I still have trouble getting a abstract accepted at the physical anthropology meetings, and I remember one time when one was rejected, and I pressed the issue home. There is no appeals process. So basically, you're at the mercy of two reviewers, and sometimes the person who's the program organizer, the sponsor for that year, then is the arbiter. But I took it to the executive board and I said, this is ridiculous. It's a total crapshoot when I submit an abstract, and sometimes it's accepted and it's well received by the audience. There'll be, just all kinds of conversation and discussion. It's always received very positive feedback. And then the next time I get two reviewers who are, curmudgeons and it's the thumbs down.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons, when I pressed the organizer to require the reviewers to back up their statements, the one comment was simply, "This is not a topic of general interest to the anthropological community." Go figure.
No
and
way.
Yet New Scientists rated it as one of the top 10 questions facing paleoanthropology today, and so you get this disconnect.
It's like, what world is that guy living in who asked that question?
Yeah, it's because they, like I said, they have stigmatized the topic to the point that all they can, when they hear it, they perceive it as just something tabloid,
Mm-hmm.
And
when you think of what is captured on that, on the Patterson-Gimlin film,
mm-hmm.
And we've all seen it, 100 times, and it's still just, it's fascinating. Do you think that those who are trying in their darndest to debunk it, to prove it as something other than what people like Mike and I believe it to be, are they just basically beating their heads against the wall? Is it definitively capture Sasquatch in your mind, or is there still questions involving that film?
No, in my mind, there is no question remaining. I'm as confident of the credibility of that, the validity of that piece of footage, as I can be, short of having stood there on the sandbar on that afternoon. It's really bizarre because as with so many things, you see the same pattern of mental. How do I put this? I haven't phrased this before quite like this, but mental. The only word that comes to mind is incompetence. Just the lack of acumen, the lack of familiarity of the. Essentially, you come back to the word ignorance, the lack of knowledge necessary in order to evaluate it from an informed perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and oftentimes quotes are taken out of context. Out of material context, but also out of temporal context. So when, like I said, I guess we'll come back to it. When viewed by the scientists at the Smithsonian, they had no place, they had no accommodation for the concept, for the potential existence of another bipedal species. Therefore, it had to be false. Mm-hmm. So why was it false? So you had people say ridiculous things. There was one who was an expert on primate skin, and yet he says, well, look at this. Isn't this laughable? It's comical. They thought to add breasts, human-like breasts on this costume, and yet anthropologists, primatologists, every primatologist worth his salt knows that primate breasts are typically devoid of hair, and yet these are hair-covered breasts. Well, first of all, the statement is just absolutely blatantly inane. Mm-hmm. It's wrong, and all you have to do is look at pictures. We've got this idea of the costume off the shelf of the gorilla with the bare chest,
right,
and hair surrounding. If you look at the chest of gorillas and of chimpanzees especially, the hair is just as dense across their chest as it is elsewhere on their body.
Mm-hmm.
Humans have hair on their chests. All you have to do to confirm that is to observe goose flesh, goose pimples, goosebumps. What is that? That is when exposed to cold, the erector pili muscle at the base of the hair follicle contracts and raises the hair to create, if there were more hair, creates
Like an insulation or some more, right?
A dead air space.
Right.
And so even though the hair now is vestigial, it's very fine, almost invisible. If a woman steps out of the shower and there's a cold breeze and she has goose flesh on her breast, that's the testament that actually she has hair all over her ventral surface.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, things like that, just ridiculous. When my favorite, and this one has such impact, such bearing, and embodies the how things could be misconstrued based on an antiquated thinking. At the time, it wasn't antiquated, but now should be acknowledged that that's an antiquated concept. So John Napier, and I've used this multiple times, so hopefully your viewers haven't heard this story before, but John Napier was a primatologist, British primatologist. He was kind of the father of studies of primate locomotion. So I was very familiar with his career, his writings, because of my training and studies. And probably the more open-minded, and as a result became a bit of a lightning rod for criticism from his fellow anthropologists and primatologists on that panel. But he was the more open-minded towards the whole thing. So much so that he, and towards the topic in general, the question in general, he, in the twilight years of his career, wrote one of the first academic published books. Bigfoot, the Yeti and Sasquatch in Myth and Reality, came out in 1972 or 73. And in it, he did conclude on the basis of the footprint evidence, and unfortunately he was struggling with a very limited sample size, but he was convinced based on the footprints that there was something out there leaving tracks, something that needed to be identified and studied. But when it came to the Patterson-Gimlin film, he was essentially thumbs down, although he was forthright enough to acknowledge he couldn't really put his finger on a good argument, except that he said when he looked at that figure, from the waist up, it looked very much like an ape, but yet from the waist down, it's got the hips and gluteals and the limbs of a human. Mm-hmm. And he said it was just nearly inconceivable to contemplate such a hybrid of structure existing in nature. It just, it's like a centaur.
Right. Yeah.
It just didn't make sense. And so on that basis, he rejected it. Well, just a few years later, we had the discovery and announcement of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, the very likely maker of the Laetoli footprints. And for the first time, we had associated pelvis and hip or knee joints and so forth of the skeleton to go with the much more complete examples, still partial, but more complete associated portions. And how were they heralded in the public press? Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, it looks essentially like a chimpanzee.
Yeah.
But from the waist down, it looks like a little hairy human. Well, presumably hairy, a little human. Isn't it curious how nature has combined in unexpected ways these suites of characteristics, this mosaic of characteristics? Well, now, wait a minute. That was the very the only linchpin for Napier's rejection of the film. What if he had waited? What if his timeline had been such that his book wasn't finished until several years after the discovery announcement of Lucy's inconceivable combination of anatomy? The point
he would have had nothing.
Yeah. The point is, now what we see on that screen which was counterintuitive in 1967 from a scientific perspective, where Napier, whether I don't know if I want to go so far as to say it was justified, but it was at least understandable where Napier was coming from in his rejection. At least there was a basis for his rejection. Now that's gone. That's gone. What we see on the film embodies exactly a suite of characteristics that were counterintuitive then, but now perfectly describe early hominin species, like Lucy, or even more so with its face, its deep, massive jaws, its flat face instead of projecting prognathic lower face like a chimpanzee, like an like Lucy, like Australopithecus afarensis. But if you look at the robust Australopithecines, the distinctive characteristics of her Patty's face are embodied in those robust Australopithecine species. If I wanted to illustrate an introductory anthro text with an image of what we think robust Australopithecines may have looked like, if this image didn't have the stigma, didn't have the notoriety attached to it, and ignoring the scale, bringing it down to 5.5 feet tall, you've got it. That would work. That would work. In one of my presentations, I juxtapose some of those images with the Patterson-Gimlin film, and it's just they're poured out of the same mold. How would Roger or anyone coaching Roger, kibitzing for him, how would they come up with that? It just and then you've got the objections that were just like the hair one, another one, which just don't make any anatomical or biomechanical sense. It's just, they're embarrassing. They're literally embarrassing. There was one who said, well, isn't this silly? They've got, the breasts suggesting it's a female, and yet it walks like a man. What? It's incongruous. Yeah, it walks. It has the stride, the gait like a male, a human male. Therefore, it must be a man in a fursuit, meaning that females, because of the wider hips, the hips joints being separated relative to by comparison to males, when women walk, then there's a tendency for more sway of the pelvis. With each step, as you swing a leg, the pelvis dips towards that swing. There are muscles to counteract that, but the muscles allow a little bit of sway. And so that, that appealing female walk is the result of the need for a larger birth canal to allow the big brain baby to pass through the pelvis. Well, if Sasquatch, as depicted in the Patterson-Gimlin film, has the brain the size of a gorilla, it doesn't need an enlarged birth canal. Ergo, its pelvis, the female pelvis, is essentially the same proportions as a male, and it walks like a man.
Nice. Yep.
It makes perfect sense.
It does.
If you would stop and think about it instead of just, blurting
dismissing
out.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Your ignorance based on preconception of what is real and what isn't real. And so, you can go through and just, and there are quite a number of statements, and those are some of the most oft repeated. The fact
the fact that film has never been debunked is enough for me. It have to, with all what we are capable of nowadays, studying, analyzing any number of film, no matter how old it is, but yet it still can't be 100% debunked. That stands out on its own. To me, it does.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. It stands up under scrutiny, under remarkable scrutiny. And just recently, together with Bill Munns and a student by the name of Isaac Tian, Isaac is a computer vision, I don't know what his actual title, researcher, technician, engineer, and more than a technician, he's an engineer. He's working on his PhD at the University of Washington. Bill Munns has decades of experience in Hollywood as a creature effects engineer. And he is a remarkable historian of cinematography and both the from the technical side of it, from the camera and film and so forth, as well as the methodologies of what takes place behind the lens while he's creating the creature effects in front of the lens. And so recently we some of our efforts were featured prominently on a Proof is Out There episode. And there was the latest rendering of the Patterson-Gimlin film using multiple scans of different copies of the film. There's this, sort of a genealogical tree of generations of copies, and so they show different artifacts. People in the digital age may not be familiar with the old school film, which utilizes photosensitive grains or crystals in an emulsion on a plastic film backing. So it's those chemicals are exposed to light, causes a reaction, which is then brought out through a chemical treatment and fixation. But instead of little square pixels, the grains are like irregular grains of sand.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have different shapes. And so each time you make a copy, whereas a pixel as a single packet can, with high fidelity, be transferred and copied to another digital file. When you take one film and, usually sometimes there's contact prints or you project it onto the film, either way, but the crystals don't line up one to one. And so there are little artifacts, edges and new edges and so forth that are introduced with each, and it loses it. It becomes grainy due to that introduction of artifacts. And when you blow an image up to the point where the grain can no longer sustain the detail, the word today would be pixelated. If your file is not of high enough resolution, when you blow it up, it looks pixelated. That's best way to describe it.
Yeah.
So by this process, what Ian did was create an algorithm that identified landmarks that allowed you to very precisely align these copies. So Bill had scanned multiple copies. So he had an archive. If you were interested in one particular frame, you could go to his archive and look at 12 different versions of that frame, 12 different copies of that frame. Well, by stacking those up, you can then average out the extraneous information and emphasize the common denominators, as well as, the spurious flecks or dirt or scratches from showing and so forth. If they appear in just 1 out of 12, then they kind of disappear, whereas the other common features are emphasized, and it adds back to the richness and density of the image. And then of course it also allows Ian to make an extremely stabilized image, much more so than it by any other means. And so not only is the image clarified, but it is stabilized so that your eye can follow more easily. There wasn't necessarily an aha revelation of any new observation, but the things that were really only visible to a trained eye who could watch those things going, even when they're kind of bouncing around a little bit, and could see past the noise to understand the underlying anatomy and function. Now, boy, they just they leap off the screen at the novice viewer, and so you can make the point with so much more impact.
Right.
And that was the result. I mean, it was one of the show's in-house critics that usually makes an appearance offering commentary. He's a biologist at a California college, and the producer was so impressed by his reaction that he had to call me right away. He calls me as he's driving. He said, "Jeff, I just had to share this with you. I just got off the phone with so-and-so." And he said he was blown away by the results. And he said he has a reputation of being rather a negative, skeptical individual with a lot of the stuff that makes it on to the proof is out there. I mean, they debunk a lot of stuff, but he said, you're making it really hard for me to remain skeptical here.
There you go. That's a good thing.
Yeah. But I mean, it just illustrated the point that it had a tremendous impact on an informed viewer. I just thought it was funny. I mean, the producer, he's kind of, as most producers in the documentaries I've been participated in are usually rather neutral, or try to at least appear to be rather neutral in their treatment of the topic, and let it go where it may. But this producer was impressed by that reaction.
Very
to
good.
The point he wanted to share that with me right away.
No, if you can just work on the pseudo skeptics.
No, God.
Well, and I, my goal is not to, I mean, it never has been to attract adherents, to convert people. It's to present the evidence in a way that they can make up their minds. And many skeptics, many ardent skeptics who pound that key or wear I sometimes say wear a bright red armband with an S on it, they are not likely to be swayed. They have their own pet objection or criticism, it seems, to the exclusion of all else. But for those who are curious, who are open-minded, who really want to know what the evidence is, this is a great step forward, I think.
Jeff, I know we have limited time.
Sure.
If we can hold on to you for another 10 minutes, that'd be great.
Oh, sure.
We do have a couple of questions from listeners I wanted to throw out there.
Please.
Before I forget.
Please.
One in particular, and this is from a longtime listener, a friend of the show, Pandora Blackthorn. She goes, even though we still have vast areas of undeveloped land in the States, have there been instances where development projects have unearthed evidence of Bigfoot? And then she also adds, how does climate change affect changes in Bigfoot habitats, such as loss of forest, increased temps, loss of water sources?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously there's, as with any species of wildlife that we might discuss, the press of population growth and development and habitat degradation is certainly, I'm sure, has a bearing. I think all indications suggest that this species is a very generalized, large omnivorous primate, and as such is probably quite adaptable to a variety of resources. But I mean, there's no question that there is an impact. We just don't have the data to confirm that. I mean, obviously, we can't confirm the existence of the creature, let alone the impact that we're having on it. I would suspect that certainly climate change, which is affecting these habitats, the protracted droughts. I've spent a lot of time in the field, and in some areas, particularly in the Intermountain West, the protracted drought reduces the resistance of the forest to insect infestation, and which also then contributes to death and even more fuels for wildfires. But you'll look out across a panorama, and as much as a third to 2/3 of the trees are dead. There's just a huge die-off that's taken place, and the fires. Honestly, the fires are really one of nature's ways to try to eradicate the infestation. It's a drastic measure. I mean, it's like cutting off an arm to save the body, but sure. I mean, I suspect that changes in temperature and so forth and rainfall. I mean, there's no question we're in a protracted pattern of drought. I must say that I have to laugh at the lengths to which the mainstream media weather people go to try to promote the fact that it gets hot in the summer as evidence of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As if this kind of heat wave has never happened before.
Right.
When in fact you only have to go back 40 years and you see the same figures, the same things. What was it? Climate change 40 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe there was that trend, but I mean, the point is there are cycles and
absolutely.
And so what the long-term consequences are for wildlife. I mean, the Arctic ice fields were supposed to be gone by now, and polar bears were supposed to be extinct, according to the most vocal proponents of global climate change. And yet the ice is at higher levels and more extensive, and bear population have increased. So again, I'm not discounting the concerns over climate change. I'm one of those who just does not put a lot of stock in the crying wolf to the extreme. But we might see things like what observations of other forms of wildlife retracting to higher elevations to avoid the heat and the drought. We may see fragmentation of habitat, which may disrupt gene flow. We've got an animal that is very mobile, however, and I've always suggested that those sightings in atypical locations could well be dispersing young adult individuals who are pushed out of one natal region and have to strike out on their own. And so sometimes, I think they're capable of covering ground. I mean, we've had some headline catching examples of there was a wolverine here in eastern Idaho that was radio collared, and I guess he just really took offense at that as an intrusion, and he struck off, and in the matter of 2 weeks he covered like 250, 300 miles and made it from Yellowstone all the way down almost to a ridge overlooking Pocatello, and then promptly turned around and went back. So again, if you've got a little quadrupedal creature the size of a small dog that covers that kind of terrain, a Sasquatch striking out across a stretch of eastern Oregon desert, sagebrush steppe at night to get from point A to point B is not out of the realm of possibility.
That's very plausible.
Yeah. Anyway,
A question.
I'll try to be more succinct here.
This is from the Bigfoot influencers, and they are asking. They say, ask Jeff about how he met Paul Freeman and how does he feel about Todd Standing's research.
Yeah. Well, Paul I met because when I was traveling down to Northern California with Richard Greenwell to he had invited me to participate in an analysis of what became known as the Redwoods video. Yes. On the way home from that very interesting experience, he pulls out of his briefcase a little booklet that had been published by Vance Orchard, who was a newspaper columnist who wrote an outdoor column in several that was carried in several of the regional newspapers around Walla Walla. And he asked me if I would write a book review. Paul's work was featured therein, as it was also featured in Grover Krantz's book. The casts that Krantz had duplicated from Paul's collection, and given the proximity of the blues there to Pullman, Washington, where Krantz was affiliated with or at the Washington State University, meant that those artifacts featured prominently. So it was through my writing the book reviewing that book, that I got into contact with Paul, as well as other personalities, Wes Summerlin, Vance Orchard, Bill Lowry, in the Walla Walla area, and then happened to pay a surprise visit.
Mhm.
So my estimation of Paul is that largely credible. Paul, though, was not a scientist.
Mhm.
And, the non-scientific approach to getting at something or presenting something or solving a problem is sometimes different.
Yes.
And
Yes.
has a different standard of evidence. And I think sometimes Paul justified the means by the end. And so if, he was convinced Sasquatch existed, and if doctoring something a little bit, something like, a footprint had collapsed, a scientist would never think to embellish in order to restore that
Right.
damaged footprint. But we had examples of obviously human fingertip fingerprints in the wrong places in tracks. And so some immediately jumped, oh, he's faking it. No, I think it was just a matter, because I've seen it so many times with people who just cannot resist the impulse when they see a footprint cast to put their hand in it.
Right. Right.
Just, to compare size or whatever. In this case, if he was getting ready to make a cast, and when, in the interim, something had collapsed or someone had stepped next to it, I think he wouldn't have thought twice about tamping down the sidewall or, diking it up a little bit with his hands. Now, Todd Standing, again, there was, I had heard some passing things. I had seen his very controversial close-up images of the faces of,
Right.
and so when he extended an invitation to go up to Canada, I took him up on it. I thought it was an opportunity, especially when I heard that Dr. Bindernagel was going to go as well. I felt in very good company.
Yeah.
And so, it was an opportunity to take a look and be able to evaluate some of his evidence firsthand. I still harbor those reservations. There are things in Paul's behavior that give me pause, but there's a lot of there's just he's drawn a lot of attention to himself, because this is one of the most common questions that I get in all settings is,
Okay.
what do you think about Todd Standing? And so my attitude sort of is, there were some interesting things that happened. As I said, I have notable reservations about some of his evidence. Some of it intrigues me. Some of it is problematic. But the criticisms that have been leveled have also been really on shaky footing. That's the thing. There was a report that was written where they picked apart, and I went through it, and just pointed out counterexample after counterexample that refuted their criticism, whether it was, the shape of the eye or a line under the nose. There were, and my point is, do not take this as an endorsement.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to point to a smoking gun, you better have better arguments than these.
Great. Perfectly said.
And so, yeah.
Now, I would be remiss. We have to. I know you need to move on here, Jeff, and we can't thank you enough again. But I had to pull this out. This is
Sure.
one of my prized possessions. I love it. The Sasquatch Field Guide by Dr. Jeff Meldrum. There's so much information just in this little pamphlet here. I highly recommend everyone go and check this out. It includes that Jane Goodall quote here. Jane Goodall quote, referring to your book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, a much-needed level of scientific analysis to the Sasquatch-Bigfoot debate. So, that's, like you said, that's in high standing right there. Well, Doctor, this has been an absolute blast for us. We could listen to you for days and days.
Yeah.
I imagine your courses, I would assume that your courses are always overflowing with enthralled students. I would, if I could enroll in a course of yours, I would.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
No, absolutely.
That's unfortunately they're not always, because there was a period of time when there were active lobbyists in my department who tried to dissuade students from taking my course.
Oh no.
Yeah. So
Nope.
So I
That's not good.
after a lot of prodding, and in anticipation of writing the sequel to Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, I thought, what a great way to help nail down the content and the outline if I'm forced to prepare lectures on that topic. So I offered an experimental course, and I was expecting it to be, like you said, a gatebuster, because of all of the queries that had come in previously. As it turned out, due to those active lobbyists, people tearing down the posters advertising the course, because it wasn't on the books, it was a special, offerings course. There were rumors that one of my most vocal critics on campus had actually encouraged students to sign up for the course, heckle me for the first 2 weeks, and then drop it before the deadline.
Boy.
No.
As it turns out, I ended up with 12 students taking the course, no anthro students, no biology students at all. They were students with general interest in the topic and we had a great time. I mean, it was a great experience and very productive one.
Absolutely.
But it was also a sad commentary on the state of affairs in my college. So, yeah.
Well, Mike and I will head down there and we'll help you out in any way we can.
That'd be absolutely fabulous. I do have one quick question.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
I've asked some of our other Bigfoot experts on, and may have asked Ron Moorhead, but the movie Harry and the Hendersons, have you seen it, and what did you think?
Oh, sure, of course I've seen it. In fact, most recently, it's funny because I introduced in one talk where I talk about my first exposure to the subject of Bigfoot, which was the Patterson-Gimlin film when it was shown in Spokane when I was about 11, and so I showed my class or my my school picture from there, and I'm this geeky looking guy with the big horn rimmed glasses, but then if you flash or Google Harry and the Hendersons and Ernie Henderson, the boy, we could have been twins.
Oh,
really?
Very nice.
His hair is even parted on the same side, the same cowlick I used to have, and the glasses and all. So yeah, no, I thought that of all the films out, because so much. This is the problem. We've had the potential for really interesting projects with high profile production companies. Legendary Pictures, for example, right about the time they first went on to the Warner Brothers lot, and Thomas Tull, landed that huge contract with Warner Brothers. He wanted to do a Sasquatch movie, a good quality movie, and actually flew me down to to Los Angeles, and I met with his creative team, and I actually had a PowerPoint, with different conceptual ideas and background about Sasquatch and so forth. But the problem is they kept hiring script writers that were from the slasher thriller horror.
Oh yeah,
genre.
yeah.
And I said, you don't get it.
Nope.
You want an action adventure, that's fine. That's great. You really want to do that, but not the Sasquatch pulling people's arms out of their sockets. And so Harry and the Hendersons was a great, exploration of many topics and development of familiar characters, nods to some prominent people like Renee DeHinden and John Green. And
oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was fun. It was a fun movie.
A lot of fun.
Mike mentioned Ron Moorhead's name. What are your thoughts on the audio recordings, the alleged audio recordings of Sasquatch vocalizations? I mean, we've all heard them, and we're like, what is that?
I've always found him intriguing, and I know Ron well, and I mean, he's taken a departure into this in my opinion, somewhat misguided notion about the role of quantum physics in the Sasquatch phenomenon. But likewise, the Scott Nelson's work, I respect his credentials and everything he brings to the table. I disagree fundamentally with some of his interpretations. I don't think that there is language there, at least not language like not a pidgin English I mean, I don't think these creatures communicate on any level close to Homo sapiens. It might be a bit more elaborate than the repertoire of a chimpanzee, but not much.
Okay.
I don't think not by much. I mean, their upright posture alone may have effects on the larynx and pharynx that allow for the a greater diversity of vocalization. But I mean, ultimately, it's up here. It's got to be. You can have the plumbing. If you don't have the wiring, the hard wiring, it doesn't do you any good. So the other hesitation, and Ron doesn't like it when I bring this up, but for me, the bottom line is the footprint evidence. That's the corroborating. That's the litmus test. And unfortunately, if you research the footprints that have been documented associated with that incident, they are not typical Sasquatch footprints. And whether that says something, I mean, or you can interpret that any way you want.
Sure.
Depending without further information, if you're depending on your inclinations and persuasions, but otherwise, I think I think fundamentally it's a very intriguing and credible set of circumstances and resulting recordings. I just think some of the interpretations that have come out as a result are a little difficult to acknowledge.
It made for extremely interesting discussion. That's for sure.
Oh, it does.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
We enjoyed talking to him quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. Most certainly.
Well, Jeff, again, Dr. Meldrum, this has been an honor and a privilege.
Great honor.
We can't thank you enough. Again, I'll put the show together. It'll be published later this evening. I encourage our listeners, go check out Sasquatch When Legend Meets Science, Biped to Strider. You're co-editor of that. There's a Bigfoot documentary available on Vudu, Discovering Bigfoot. Dr. Meldrum, you were involved heavily in that. I feel like we could have gone on and on about so many things, but time is limited. Where can people find you? What is up next for Dr. Jeff Meldrum?
Yeah. Well, I don't have a web page per se other than my faculty, but my Facebook page under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum, I try to keep any announcements of upcoming events. I think the next one that's on the calendar is when I'm going to Vernal, Utah in early September. Yeah, the summer, I'm just going to finish out the summer. I've got a string of writing projects that are vying for attention and deadlines to meet, and prospects for a couple of grant proposals I'm writing, maybe to I still have a lot of work to archive and maximize the utility of the footprint cast collection. So that's high on the priority as well. And then hopefully by next summer, we'll maybe be ready to undertake some environmental DNA survey work and see if we can get some proper DNA analysis, thorough and systematically complete DNA analysis.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Man, I can't thank you enough. And Mike and I, we've had a blast, Jeff.
And I can speak for both of us. I know that we are forever a fan.
Yes.
Well, I hope we were able to cover enough ground. I know these are stories that you kind of turn the spigot and it's hard to turn it back off. And therefore we don't get to cover as much of a range of topics, and sometimes get I think it's important information.
It is
important insight into the machinations of what goes on and why, especially the notion of why the science has taken such an adversarial stance towards this. But like I said, I hate to dwell on the negative, and there's so many fascinating topics of discussion. Like you say, we could talk all night. Scratch the surface. So anytime in the future, if you want to.
Oh my gosh. Part two.
We appreciate that.
Part two. I'll be in touch. Doctor. I'll let you know when it's published. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Have a good night, sir.
All right. Thanks. Take care.